believe it or not, Rick Perry actually said something kind of smart last week. He said that the 2016 election will be important because the next president could appoint as many as 4 new Supreme Court justices. Of course, Perry is worried that the court's going to lose its corporate majority, and I have Ian Millhiser here to tell us how the court became a tool for the wealthy and a tool for corporate America. Ian, we have an American public that right now has a favorable rating of the U.S. Supreme Court judges at about 10% favorable, unheard of in American history. They brought it on themselves, didn't they?
They did, and they brought it on themselves really through most of American history. I mean, I discussed this in my book, Injustices. The Supreme Court's history is we had Dred Scott, which was a pro-slavery decision. We ratified 3 constitutional amendments to get rid of Dred Scott, and the Supreme Court spent the next 30 years basically writing those out of the Constitution. They spent 40 years after that rewriting one of them to protect the wealthiest and most powerful Americans. That's when child labor laws were struck down. And now you look at what our court is doing, and it seems to want to repeat many of the sins of the past. So you have Citizens United saying that wealthy individuals and corporations can inject all kinds of money into our elections. You have decisions striking down the Voting Rights Act. There's a case in front of the court right now that could take health care away from as many as 8 million people.
Yeah, well, you mentioned in your book, and by the way, we have it up on the screen here throughout the show so people can get this book. It's very important to understand, certainly going into the 2016 election. But you mentioned that history tells us that this court we have right now is really not all that aberrational, that we have a long American history of bad Supreme Court justices. And here's what people miss, and this is an observation from my standpoint as an attorney who spent a lot of time studying constitutional law. The average American doesn't understand that these corporate types that are appointed to the Supreme Court, that's generally what happened. Thurgood Marshall was very unusual.
Right.
Most of the Supreme Court judges come up the corporate ladder. They work for corporations. The only money they make in their life is paid to them by corporations. Their ideology is built around that corporation. And historically, those are the people who've controlled the Supreme Court. And that's exactly what we have here right now, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's certainly something that's built into the structure, I think, of the legal profession. You know, we draw our Supreme Court justices from the best, the most distinguished lawyers, and that's a good thing. But the problem is that the way that the economics of the legal profession are set up, the best jobs, or at least the most desirable jobs for most lawyers who achieve that stature, are representing very well-moneyed interests. You know, when I was in law school, it was surprisingly very easy to get a job in a big law firm, and much more difficult to find a job as a lawyer where you were working for a prominent public interest group, where you're in a government job that would set you up to do something really great. Those jobs were actually, the good jobs on that side were actually very difficult to get. So it's certainly true that the pool of lawyers that justices tend to be drawn from tend to be people who spend a whole lot of time representing corporate interests. And sure, that's going to affect the way that the Supreme Court behaves.
It's built into the system, I guess is the best way to put it. Corporate lawyer is the guy that gets the tap because he has the corporate money behind him from the beginning to end, has the corporate influence on the appointment process. And so we end up with a lot of corporate hacks throughout American history. Your book, by the way, is excellent. It's very well done in trying to understand the inner workings of all this. I'm a little bothered by what's happening in the U.S. right now with this notion. For example, when we talk about Hillary, we say, well, gee whiz, we have to elect her. She has a bunch of bad policies. She really is not a progressive in any sense of the word who's going to move the ball much for progressive issues in America. But we have to vote for her because if we don't, then there's going to be 4 justices appointed after the 2016 election, and we're all going to suffer. We're kind of held hostage by this fear-mongering in a sense. Do you sense that at all, Ian?
Well, I mean, I'm fortunate enough to work for a nonprofit, which means I get to stay far, far away from endorsing anyone in the presidential election.
Right.
But I will say this. I mean, the fears about what will happen depending on who's picking our next set of justices, they're not unfounded. The next president is likely to get to appoint 4 justices. That's just because of the ages of the justices. We have 3 of them are going to be 80 when the next president is sworn in. And if you add those 4 to Justice Thomas, who has said that child labor laws are unconstitutional, or at least endorsed that reading of the Constitution, who has endorsed a reading of the Constitution which says that we can't have a Civil Rights Act, which says that we can't have a minimum wage. If we had 4 more justices like that, and certainly the trend on the conservative side is towards wanting more justices in the vein of a Clarence Thomas, we're in for a pretty wild ride. That puts us on the bridge to the 19th century.
Well, let me back up here just a little bit. You talk about in your book, and you make a very good point to where, yeah, these people that we have on the court right now are horrendous. There's no other way to describe them. They're awful. They're ideologues in the worst kind of way. They're getting ready, for example, to make a decision on King v. Burwell, which has to do with Obamacare. And they're going to make the question is, what kind of bad decision are they going to make? It's going to be some variation of a bad decision, probably. But when you take a look at what the court has done in the past, to tell you how bad the history of the court has been, you had a Supreme Court during the FDR years that we had 20-30% of the population out of work, going hungry, child poverty, and all people didn't have homes, they didn't have places to work. It was awful. But you still had a Supreme Court that had come up through the corporate ladder that was still willing to vote for the corporate side.
Right.
So in comparison, it's about the same thing, isn't it?
Well, I think what you've seen throughout American history is that, the Industrial Revolution happened. That concentrated a great deal of wealth in very few people's hands. After industrialization, after the railroads, it was possible for an individual or for a corporation to amass wealth that kings could not amass before. And that gave them a tremendous amount of power, gave them a tremendous amount of influence over politicians, over who got put on the Supreme Court. And they had a philosophy that basically said government is bad. The free market was practically written into the Constitution, and we can't have these silly lawmakers dickering around with it. That was their philosophy, and that really captured the Supreme Court from the late 19th century through the 1930s. What bothers me about the world that we're in right now, I cover the Federalist Society's conference every year. They're the leading conservative legal group, and they are aching to go back to that world. They had a panel at their last conference about why we shouldn't have civil rights laws. They had another panel about why we shouldn't have a minimum wage. So they are aching for this sort of notion that we should look at any attempt to regulate the business world with skepticism. And unfortunately, while there's very few Americans who agree with that,
they have a huge influence, don't they? I mean, if you think about it,
Yeah.
Federalist Society they have a huge influence on who these court appointments are. Ian, great book, great work as usual. It's a book people need to read. Thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you so much for having me.
Ian Millhiser is the author of the new book, Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted.